At precisely 3:10 a.m. on August 21, 1942, the slender strip of sand at Alligator Creek, located on Guadalcanal, transformed into a brutal test of wills and weaponry. Approximately 200 Japanese combatants advanced relentlessly across the moon-drenched shore, heading directly toward the dug-in Marine positions. In the profound obscurity of the early morning, American machine gun operators meticulously tracked the approaching adversaries through their weapon sights. 20 yards, then 15 yards, finally 10 yards. The enemy soldiers were so near that their facial features were discernible, their labored breathing audible, and close enough to hurl hand grenades. Every primal instinct urged the Marines to unleash a torrent of fire. Conventional military manuals unequivocally stated, engage at maximum effective range. Every seasoned veteran understood the cardinal rule: never permit the enemy to close to such proximity. Yet on this particular night, the Marines steadfastly withheld their fire. Tonight, they were deliberately contravening every established principle of defensive combat, primarily because Major General Alexander Vandergrift had ingeniously reconceptualized this impending engagement as an intricate mathematical equation: pre-calculated artillery coordinates, meticulously designed interlocking fields of fire, and 37mm canister rounds, each containing 122 steel spheres, poised in weapon barrels like gargantuan shotgun charges, had all been prepared with painstaking precision. The Japanese forces, buoyed by their recent successes, firmly believed they were on the verge of overwhelming yet another American stronghold through sheer force of spirit and their proven night combat tactics. They were utterly oblivious to the fact that they were advancing into what would become the most meticulously engineered killing zone in the annals of Marine Corps history. Occasionally, permitting your adversary to draw too close is not an error in judgment. It is, in fact, a cunningly devised snare. Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki stood with an air of anticipation on the deck of the destroyer Kagero as it sliced through the inky, tumultuous waters en route to Guadalcanal. His thoughts were entirely consumed by what Japanese senior officers had collectively termed victory fever. This pervasive sentiment had spread like an uncontrollable conflagration throughout the Imperial Army subsequent to the attack on Pearl Harbor, fostering an intoxicating conviction that American forces would inevitably capitulate under a determined assault, much as Chinese regiments had crumbled across numerous battlefields. Ichiki personally carried the psychological burden of a forfeited triumph. His regiment had originally been designated for the crucial capture of Midway Atoll, a strategic prize that would have undoubtedly reinvigorated Japan's strategic momentum in the Pacific theater. However, that pivotal operation had been unceremoniously canceled, leaving his elite soldiers with an insatiable yearning for the kind of spectacular victory that would definitively establish Japanese military supremacy, once and for all. We implore you to stay with us and watch the conclusion of this video. We would be immensely grateful for your like and subscription. Please also consider leaving a comment below, sharing where you are from, and your thoughts on the crucial topic discussed in this video. The initial intelligence assessments had been remarkably encouraging. Aerial reconnaissance conducted on August 12th indicated minimal activity around the American perimeter surrounding Henderson Field. When Ichiki's forward elements disembarked near Chew Point on August 18th, approximately 25 miles east of the main Marine positions, his radio operators confidently reported back no enemy contact proceeding as planned. Higher headquarters had conservatively estimated American troop strength on Guadalcanal at perhaps 3,000 personnel, presumed to be widely dispersed and demoralized after their hasty landing. The strategic calculations appeared deceptively straightforward. Ichiki commanded 917 highly trained, elite troops from the 28th Infantry Regiment. A swift, decisive night attack, it was reasoned, would easily overwhelm whatever token force the Americans had left to guard their invaluable airfield. What Ichiki could not possibly have known, as his men commenced their arduous march along the coastal road toward Henderson Field, was that Major General Vandergrift actually commanded nearly 11,000 battle-hardened Marines on the island. More critically, Vandergrift had spent the preceding 2 weeks fundamentally transforming American defensive doctrine in ways that would have seemed utterly inconceivable to officers trained in traditional Marine tactics, where conventional Marine Corps manuals heavily emphasized aggressive assault and rapid maneuver. Vandergrift was implementing something truly revolutionary: defensive warfare meticulously conceived as precision engineering. This profound transformation had commenced with an exhaustive terrain analysis. Vandergrift scrutinized the various approaches to Henderson Field with the meticulous eye of a seasoned civil engineer rather than a conventional military commander. The dense jungle terrain naturally channeled any potential eastern approach toward a singular, unavoidable crossing point, the mouth of Alligator Creek, where a narrow sand spit offered the only practical ford during low tide. To the north, the vast expanse of the ocean provided absolutely no concealment. To the south, the impenetrable jungle rendered large unit movement almost impossible. Any significant assault originating from the east would therefore be compelled to traverse that vulnerable sand spit. Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Pollock, who commanded the 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, had initially grappled with Vandergrift's unconventional defensive concept. Traditional Marine doctrine heavily emphasized overwhelming fire and decisive maneuver, aggressive patrolling, and engaging the enemy as far forward as strategically feasible. However, Vandergrift's radical plan called for a strategy that felt almost passive, deliberately allowing the enemy to approach within hand grenade range before unleashing a devastating volley of fire. The psychological burden on individual Marines would be immense. Every ingrained instinct would scream to engage targets at their maximum effective range, not to patiently wait until Japanese soldiers were close enough for their faces to be clearly visible. Yet, as Pollock meticulously walked the defensive positions day after day, painstakingly checking fields of fire and optimizing weapon placement, the geometric precision inherent in Vandergrift's concept became strikingly clear. This was not a passive defense. It was an intricate form of mathematical warfare. The sophisticated defensive system incorporated water-cooled M117A1 Browning machine guns, strategically positioned with meticulously planned interlocking sectors of fire. Each gun crew was rigorously trained to steadfastly hold their designated sector, while neighboring guns provided crucial overlapping coverage for any potential gaps. Pre-registered mortar concentrations and devastating artillery fires from the 11th Marines with coordinates precisely measured by daylight allowed crews to dial in incredibly accurate fires even in complete darkness. Most critically, 37mm M3 anti-tank guns were loaded with M2 canister rounds, each shell packed with an astounding 122 steel balls that would transform the narrow sand spit into an utterly inescapable killing funnel. The level of discipline demanded was absolutely unprecedented. Marine machine gunners were accustomed to engaging targets at ranges of 400 to 600 yards whenever possible. Vandergrift's audacious plan called for them to hold their fire until Japanese forces were within a mere 30 yards, close enough that individual enemy soldiers could potentially hurl grenades into Marine positions, and close enough that the intense psychological pressure would severely test every man's nerve. But at that precise range, the 37mm canister rounds would function like colossal shotgun blasts, each shell possessing the terrifying capability of cutting down multiple attackers simultaneously. Private First Class Frank Pomeroy, who was manning one of the formidable water-cooled Brownings along the creek line, had spent the preceding days desperately trying to reconcile this radical new doctrine with every tenet he had ever been taught about marine warfare. The M1917A1 was capable of sustaining cyclic rates of 450 to 600 rounds per minute, its innovative water jacket effectively preventing the barrel overheating that frequently plagued air-cooled weapons during extended firefights. But firing at such dangerously close range meant accepting the grim reality that some enemy soldiers would inevitably reach Marine positions before being cut down by the overwhelming firepower. The intricate defensive blueprint mandated an unwavering reliance on the meticulous spatial arrangement of mutually supporting barrages and the devastating efficacy of specialized canister ammunition. Company G of the 1st Marines had been strategically deployed as the agile reinforcement unit, poised to execute immediate counter-assaults against any Japanese incursions before they could be consolidated. This particular assignment constituted perhaps the most mentally arduous role within Vandergrift's comprehensive tactical framework. While other Marine units would experience the reassurance of direct engagement with their firearms, Company G faced the demanding task of remaining static in reserve positions, confiding in the operational integrity of the designated destruction area, yet prepared to launch swift retaliatory strikes should any Japanese forces manage to penetrate the primary defensive line. As the late hours of August 20th transitioned into the early morning of August 21st, reconnaissance dispatches from vigilant coast watchers confirmed the westward movement of a substantial enemy contingent along the coastal thoroughfare. The Marines, diligently entrenching themselves along Alligator Creek, remained unaware that they were about to partake in an unprecedented operational trial, destined to fundamentally alter U.S. military strategy for the remainder of the Pacific conflict. Their understanding was limited to the fact that their senior commander had instructed them to allow the adversary to draw near, a proximity far closer than any Marine manual had ever contemplated, and to rely on calculated methodology rather than primal intuition. Stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Please write a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. The very topography of the land prescribed the lethal spatial configuration. Lieutenant Colonel Pollock had dedicated myriad hours meticulously analyzing the ground where Alligator Creek converged with the sea. Grasping that effective defensive engineering commenced with interpreting the landscape as an architectural schematic. The creek itself served as an inherent obstruction, flowing roughly from north to south, before executing an eastward bend to discharge into the vast ocean. On its western bank, where the Marines had established their primary defensive perimeter, the ground ascended slightly, affording unimpeded sightlines and expansive firing sectors across the restricted sandy isthmus that functioned as the sole feasible transit route during periods of low tide. To the northern expanse, the open ocean provided no cover whatsoever for attacking forces. Time. Twos. Conversely, to the south, an impenetrable thicket of vegetation formed an almost impassable obstruction to significant troop maneuvers. Consequently, any substantial assault originating from the eastern direction would inevitably be directed into a constricted zone of annihilation, measuring less than 50 yards in width. Pollock had positioned his machine guns with meticulous exactitude. Each M19-117A1 Browning was precisely aimed to dominate particular zones, interlocking with adjacent armaments to eradicate any unprotected areas. The water-cooled barrels of these weapons were engineered to endure continuous volleys, a critical feature for the prolonged firing periods demanded by this defensive concept, unlike air-cooled counterparts that would become incapacitated by excessive heat during protracted conflicts. Each gun crew had spent days calibrating distances to crucial topographical elements, meticulously setting their aiming markers for established points of engagement. Under the shroud of night, when optical verification became impossible, the machine gunners possessed the capability to pivot their firearms to pre-calibrated coordinates and execute precise barrages solely through numerical computation rather than relying on visual confirmation. The heavy ordnance element of Vandergrift's defensive scheme represented perhaps the most intricate targeting strategy the Marine Corps had ever attempted in combat. Forward observers from the 11th Marines had diligently predetermined impact zones on the eastern bank of Alligator Creek, meticulously measuring exact ranges and directional orientations during daylight hours. These precise coordinates were subsequently mapped onto ballistic diagrams, thereby enabling artillery crews positioned miles behind the front lines to deliver accurate fires under conditions of absolute obscurity. This sophisticated system elevated nocturnal bombardments from speculative endeavors to meticulous scientific operations. When observers requested fires on these pre-registered concentrations, gun crews could simply input the pre-established parameters and fire, confident their rounds would impact precisely where needed. The 37mm anti-tank guns constituted the most ingenious component of the defensive plan. Conceived principally for confronting hostile armored vehicles, these weapons were being innovatively utilized in a ground troop assistance capacity that capitalized on their distinct attributes. Each M3 gun was loaded with M2 canister rounds, each containing 122 steel balls. Upon firing, these rounds functioned like colossal scattershot cartridges, unleashing a conical zone of devastation capable of incapacitating numerous assailants concurrently. At ranges spanning 20 to 30 yards, the canister rounds would attain peak efficacy, with individual steel balls retaining deadly momentum while dispersing across the full breadth of the sand spit crossing point. Time. Twos. The mental strains imposed by this defensive system surpassed the scope of any previous Marine Corps instruction, challenging the men in ways their training had not prepared them for. Private First Class Pomeroy and his machine gun crew had practiced the techniques repeatedly, yet the stark reality of allowing armed enemy soldiers to approach within hand grenade range provoked fundamental self-preservation impulses. The M19-117A1 machine gun could efficiently engage objectives at ranges of 800 to 1,000 yards under optimal circumstances. However, waiting until Japanese forces closed to within 30 yards meant consciously accepting that some attackers would unavoidably attain locations from which they could launch grenades or even attempt to breach isolated defensive emplacements before being cut down. Fire discipline therefore emerged as the paramount determinant that would dictate victory or defeat. Each weapon system had been allocated distinct duties within the comprehensive tactical arrangement. The 37mm guns were mandated to engage only when Japanese forces reached the pre-established annihilation area on the sand spit. Machine guns, in turn, were instructed to restrain their shooting until the shotgun-like ammunition had been utilized, then to open up with mutually supporting barrages to neutralize any remaining combatants attempting to continue the assault. Artillery concentrations were specifically tasked with targeting the eastern bank to obstruct additional forces from aiding the initial assault waves. The synchronization needed to be flawless. Initiating engagement prematurely would enable enemy troops to scatter and find sanctuary. Conversely, waiting too long presented the peril of being overwhelmed before the defensive fires could realize their desired outcome. Company G, positioned as the immediate counterattack force, represented the ultimate component in Vandergrift's strategic calculation. Should Japanese forces manage to penetrate the primary perimeter despite the concentrated fires, Company G was prepared to launch swift retaliatory strikes to restore the position before the enemy could fortify their advantages. This required the reserve company to remain in concealed locations, ready to deploy rapidly, while trusting that the primary defensive positions would channel any penetration into discernible pathways where counter-assaults could be most effective. The comprehensive engineering involved in the defensive scheme extended far beyond the mere placement of weaponry, encompassing sophisticated protocols for ammunition management and precise resupply operations. Each machine gun emplacement, for instance, had been meticulously provisioned with an ample supply of rounds, theoretically sufficient to sustain prolonged combat. However, crews received stringent directives to discharge their weapons in controlled, disciplined bursts rather than maintaining continuous streams of fire. While the robust, water-cooled barrels were inherently capable of enduring extended periods of firing, the strategic conservation of ammunition remained an absolutely paramount concern. Similarly, artillery teams had carefully pre-positioned additional shells at their gun locations, guided by meticulously crafted firing programs that precisely allocated specific quantities of rounds to each pre-registered target concentration. A particular constraint applied to the 37mm guns, which carried a strictly limited stock of canister ammunition, rendering the selection of targets and the precise timing of their engagement critically important for maximum effectiveness. As the dusk of August 20th descended, cloaking the landscape in shadow, the Marines, systematically settling into their assigned positions along the serpentine curve of Alligator Creek, harbored a profound awareness that they were on the precipice of testing a defensive paradigm. This innovative concept fundamentally challenged the long-held, ingrained assumptions characteristic of traditional Marine Corps tactical doctrine. The ultimate triumph of General Vandergrift's meticulously conceived plan rested not upon the sporadic brilliance of individual acts of heroism or daring, aggressive maneuvers, but rather on the unwavering collective discipline of the entire force and an almost mathematical exactitude in its execution. Each Marine was compelled to place implicit trust in the notion that their specific, seemingly small contribution within the grander, intricate geometric pattern would seamlessly integrate into a defensive system. This system was ingeniously engineered to transmute the raw, visceral brutality of close-quarters combat into a predictable, solvable equation. The psychological burden weighing upon each soldier was undeniably immense, yet the underlying engineering, in its intricate design and foresight, was nothing short of flawless. At a mere 20 yards, abstract mathematics was poised to confront the grim realities of modern warfare. Stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Write a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. At precisely 3:10 a.m. on the morning of August 21st, the distinct, unsettling sound of splashing water began to carry across the narrow expanse of the sand spit. This indicated the commencement of the enemy's advance as approximately 200 Japanese soldiers initiated their determined assault, wading across the mouth of Alligator Creek. Private First Class Frank Pomeroy, with unwavering focus, pressed his eye to the rear sight of his M91 Browning machine gun. Through the moonlight, he observed dark, indistinct figures materializing from the dense, oppressive jungle canopy, subsequently beginning their deliberate movement across the pale, moon-drenched beach. His water-cooled machine gun, a formidable instrument of defense, was fully loaded and poised for action, its intricate traverse and elevation mechanisms already meticulously adjusted to encompass and dominate its pre-assigned sector of fire. Every primal instinct within him clamored for immediate action, urging him to unleash a torrent of fire. The impulse was overwhelming to cut down the advancing enemy as they were starkly silhouetted against the pale expanse of sand and the dark, reflective surface of the water. However, Pomeroy steadfastly resisted this urge, maintaining a rigid hold on his fire. He adhered strictly to the formidable discipline that Lieutenant Colonel Pollock had painstakingly ingrained into the very core of every Marine positioned along that crucial defensive line, a testament to months of rigorous training. The Japanese soldiers, in their advance, exuded the palpable confidence of seasoned troops who firmly believed they were executing a perfectly orchestrated surprise attack. Their hushed voices, a mixture of whispered commands and the low murmurs of exertion, carried faintly across the narrow stretch of water. Officers could be heard issuing low-toned orders, while enlisted men struggled valiantly to maintain their formations amidst the treacherous, uneven bottom of the creek mouth. Some, losing their footing in the unexpectedly deeper channels, stumbled awkwardly, their equipment clattering with telltale sounds as they regained their balance. In contrast, others moved with a more fluid, practiced grace, clearly revealing themselves as veterans of previous nocturnal operations in China, where similar stealth tactics had consistently proven devastatingly effective in overwhelming Chinese defensive positions. Tragically for the advancing Japanese force, they harbored no inkling whatsoever that they were inexorably progressing into a precisely calibrated killing zone. With each measured step, they drew closer to what was, in essence, the mathematical epicenter of the Marines' elaborate defensive scheme. It was at this focal point that multiple overlapping fields of fire were meticulously designed to converge, promising to unleash their destructive power with the most absolute and devastating effect imaginable. 25 yards from the western bank, 20 yards, 15 yards. The distances were called out with chilling precision. The leading elements of the Japanese assault force had now closed the gap to such an extent that individual Marines, peering through the dim moonlight, could distinctly discern the features of their faces. They were close enough to hear the labored breathing of men who, in their profound misconception, believed they were on the verge of overrunning yet another American position, confident in the superiority of their fighting spirit and their honed night fighting techniques. At a critically close range of just 10 yards, Lieutenant Colonel Pollock issued the definitive command, a single word that would serve as the ultimate crucible for months of exhaustive preparation and meticulous planning. Fire. The potent command reverberated along the entire defensive line, articulated not as a panicked cry, but as a controlled, disciplined shout. This signal instantaneously triggered the most intensely concentrated burst of firepower the Marine Corps had ever delivered in such dangerously close proximity to an enemy. The 37mm M3 guns were the first to erupt, their specialized canister rounds detonating across the constricted sand spit, with the colossal force and widespread impact reminiscent of enormous shotgun blasts. Each M2 canister shell, upon detonation, unleashed a devastating cloud of 122 steel balls in an expanding, lethal cone of destruction. This swept across the entire width of the crossing point, simultaneously cutting down a multitude of attackers. The effect was immediate, visceral, and utterly devastating. Japanese soldiers, who had been advancing in disciplined formation, were abruptly scattered across the sand, their carefully built assault momentum instantly shattered by the precisely timed and overwhelming canister fire. However, this initial brutal volley was merely the opening act of the comprehensive Marine defensive plan. As soon as the 37mm guns had expended their initial, decisive rounds, the M1917A1 machine guns immediately commenced firing. They established a relentless, interlocking network of suppressive fire that meticulously covered every single square yard of the designated killing zone. Private First Class Pomeroy pressed his trigger, feeling the familiar, reassuring vibration of the water-cooled weapon cycling with its sustained, formidable rate of 450 rounds per minute. The gun's finely tuned traverse mechanism enabled him to efficiently sweep his assigned sector, while neighboring crews seamlessly coordinated their fire, ensuring that no critical gaps or areas of vulnerability remained within the deadly perimeter. The Japanese assault, which had commenced with the disciplined confidence born of elite infantry executing a proven, successful tactic, rapidly dissolved into utter chaos and disarray. This catastrophic disintegration was a direct consequence of the merciless mathematical precision with which the American defensive fires took effect. Those soldiers who, against all odds, had managed to survive the initial devastating canister rounds found themselves inexorably caught within the relentless, overlapping machine gun fires. This inescapable gauntlet offered no dead space, no conceivable covered approaches, and absolutely no viable escape routes back to the relative safety of the eastern bank. The geometric perfection inherent in General Vandergrift's defensive plan was thus revealing its profound efficacy in the most brutal and uncompromising terms imaginable. Yet even this unprecedented concentration of firepower could not completely halt every single attacking soldier. A few Japanese troops, driven by an ingrained, almost fanatical training and the sheer desperation of their predicament, continued their relentless advance, pushing through the inferno of defensive fires. Miraculously, some managed to reach the western bank of Alligator Creek. A handful even succeeded in overrunning isolated Marine fighting positions employing their bayonets and grenades to create small, localized breaches within the formidable defensive line. For a fleeting moment, the meticulously crafted mathematical perfection of the defensive scheme appeared momentarily threatened by the unpredictable, fluid variables of individual human courage and the sheer randomness of survival. Crucially, this precise contingency had been meticulously anticipated by both Vandergrift and Pollock. Consequently, Company G, which had been strategically held in reserve behind the main defensive line, received immediate orders to launch a counterattack. The reserve Marines moved with a practiced, almost surgical efficiency, their swift advance expertly covered by continued suppressive machine gun fires. This sustained covering fire was vital in preventing the Japanese forces from consolidating their meager gains or establishing any meaningful foothold. The ensuing counterattack was executed with remarkable swiftness and decisive force, effectively clearing the few Japanese soldiers who had managed to reach the western bank. They were eliminated before they could establish any substantial position or, crucially, signal their limited success to the reinforcements patiently awaiting their turn on the eastern side of the creek. On the eastern side of the creek, the principles of defensive warfare, meticulously calculated and implemented, were demonstrating their undeniable efficacy in the unfolding chaos of the battle. Yet, the intense actions of the night were far from reaching their conclusion. As Company G diligently worked to restore the structural integrity of their primary defensive line, Japanese forces situated on the eastern bank initiated a relentless barrage of indirect fire, utilizing mortars and 70mm infantry guns to pound the Marine positions. The enemy commanders, having come to the stark realization that their initial ill-fated assault had met with catastrophic failure, were now desperately attempting to suppress the American defensive fires. Their objective was to create a sufficient window of opportunity to reorganize and launch a second, more concerted attack. Mortar rounds descended with terrifying force, exploding amidst the Marine fighting positions and briefly illuminating the battlefield in a series of hellish flashes. These fleeting bursts of light starkly revealed the grim extent of Japanese casualties, their bodies strewn across the sand spit. The relentless incoming indirect fire severely tested the fortitude and resolve of individual Marines who were compelled to steadfastly maintain their positions even as mortar fragments shrieked overhead and 70mm shells detonated with jarring impact along their carefully prepared defensive line. Private First Class Pomeroy, a figure of unwavering determination, remained hunched over his machine gun, his gaze diligently sweeping his assigned sector for any indication of a renewed enemy assault. He consciously endeavored to disregard the jarring explosions that, with each successive salvo, seemed to creep ever closer to his precarious position. The water jacket of his M19-117A1, a testament to its sustained and furious firing, had grown considerably hot. However, the weapon's meticulously designed cooling system was performing flawlessly, a critical factor that enabled him to maintain a high degree of accurate fire without succumbing to the debilitating barrel overheating issues that frequently plagued air-cooled weaponry in similar high-intensity engagements. The initial phase of what would later be known as the Battle of Alligator Creek had unequivocally showcased the devastatingly lethal effectiveness of Vandergrift sophisticated defensive engineering. Nevertheless, Both sides involved in this brutal confrontation understood implicitly that the fighting was far from over and that more bloodshed was inevitable. Japanese forces retained their control over the eastern bank of the creek, and their continued indirect fires served as an ominous harbinger, clearly indicating preparations for additional desperate assault attempts. The Marines, for their part, had undeniably proven that their defensive concept functioned with unparalleled efficiency at close quarters, but the ultimate decisive test-pitting mathematical warfare against traditional offensive tactics was still looming on the horizon. After 2 or 3 paragraphs, ask us to stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Write a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. The second Japanese assault commenced with a methodical precision that suggested commanders who believed they had meticulously analyzed and learned from their initial, costly failure. Another company-sized contingent, comprising approximately 150 determined men, began their advance towards the very same narrow sandpit where their comrades had been so brutally cut down less than an hour prior. However, instead of acknowledging the fundamental and irremediable flaws inherent in their tactical approach, the Japanese officers had erroneously concluded that their defeat stemmed from insufficient numbers and a lack of proper coordination. Consequently, they moved forward with a renewed and grim determination, firmly convinced that a larger force, advancing in a more cohesive and disciplined formation, would inevitably overwhelm the American defensive positions through the sheer, irresistible weight of a massed attack. Private First Class Pomeroy, his senses sharpened by the preceding engagement, meticulously observed the development of this new assault through the sight of his trusty machine gun. He noted with a professional detachment how the advancing Japanese soldiers carefully navigated around the lifeless forms of their fallen comrades, their bodies tragically scattered across the sandy terrain. The enemy formation, he observed, appeared more disciplined and orderly than the preceding wave, with officers visibly maintaining a tighter control and soldiers advancing in more coherent, structured lines. Yet, from his fortified position behind the M19 117A1, Pomeroy possessed a crucial understanding that the attacking Japanese could not possibly grasp. They were, in essence, marching headlong into a killing zone that had been meticulously refined and perfected by the brutal lessons of the previous engagement. The 37mm gun crews, having tirelessly worked during the brief lull, had reloaded their formidable weapons with a fresh supply of canister rounds, ensuring they were ready for the next onslaught. Artillery observers, their calculations precise and unwavering, had reconfirmed that their pre-registered concentrations remained impeccably accurate, ready to unleash devastating fire upon command. Machine gun crews, demonstrating their adaptability and quick learning, had adjusted their aiming stakes based on the invaluable lessons gleaned from the ferocity of the first assault, optimizing their targeting for maximum lethality. When the second wave of Japanese attackers reached the exact mathematical center point that had so tragically triggered the previous slaughter, Lieutenant Colonel Pollock, with a chilling resolve, once again issued the unequivocal order to fire. However, on this occasion, the defensive fires achieved an even more devastating and cataclysmic outcome. The 37mm canister rounds, precisely aimed at the densest concentrations of the enemy formation, created interlocking cones of utter destruction that swept with terrifying efficiency across the entire width of the sand spit. The Japanese soldiers, who had advanced with such painstaking formation discipline and unwavering resolve, were cut down en masse by a torrent of steel balls that maintained their lethal velocity with horrifying efficacy at such short ranges. Those few who miraculously survived the initial brutal canister fire found themselves immediately engaged by the relentless chatter of machine guns. These crews, having utilized the brief interval between attacks to meticulously refine their target acquisition and fire distribution techniques, operated with chilling precision. The mathematical exactitude of Vandergrift's defensive concept was now revealing its most brutal and unforgiving characteristic. Each successive engagement served only to make the system more devastatingly effective. The Marine gunners were rapidly learning to coordinate their fires with increasing efficiency, systematically eliminating the small gaps in timing and the minor delays that had, during the first assault, allowed a handful of Japanese soldiers to momentarily reach the western bank. The kill zone, through this iterative process, was becoming more perfectly calibrated with each harrowing test, transforming from a theoretical engineering marvel into a practiced and brutally effective execution of defensive warfare that left absolutely no room for individual heroics or tactical improvisation to overcome its relentless efficiency. As the first faint streaks of dawn began to paint the eastern sky, Japanese commanders, in a desperate and final attempt to salvage their failing offensive, implemented a flanking maneuver. This action demonstrated both a certain degree of tactical imagination and, simultaneously, a profound misunderstanding of the dire situation they faced. Instead of persisting with their suicidal assaults on the heavily defended Sandspit crossing, they issued orders for troops to move northward along the beach and endeavor to wade around the Marine left flank, advancing through the surf beyond the breakers. The underlying concept behind this maneuver exhibited a sophisticated tactical thinking. By moving through chest-deep water, the attacking force theoretically aimed to bypass the concentrated defensive fires that had proven so lethally effective at the mouth of the creek. However, the Japanese flanking attempt served only to further demonstrate how comprehensively Vandergrift's defensive planning had anticipated every conceivable avenue of approach. The Marines, strategically positioned on the northern end of their formidable defensive line, possessed clear observation and unobstructed fields of fire that extended well into the surf zone. Japanese soldiers, struggling laboriously through chest-deep water, their weapons held precariously above their heads in a futile attempt to keep them dry, presented perfectly exposed targets for the waiting machine gunners. These gunners could engage them at ranges where the M19-170E1s achieved their maximum accuracy and devastating effect. The attacking troops moved with agonizing slowness through the turbulent surf, utterly unable to find cover or return any effective fire, while simultaneously battling to maintain their balance against the relentless force of the ocean swells. The meticulously planned artillery barrages, precisely calibrated for this specific scenario, commenced their destructive descent upon the Japanese formations at precisely 0400 hours, followed by a second intense volley at 0515. These high-explosive projectiles erupted, sending colossal plumes of water and sand skyward, exacerbating the already dire predicament of soldiers who wrestled against the churning surf to preserve their unit cohesion. Simultaneously, a lethal fusillade of machine gun fire, originating from several strategically placed emplacements, converged upon the exposed Japanese flanking maneuver, decimating troops who found scant refuge in the water, which paradoxically impeded their advance and rendered them more vulnerable. This audacious flanking strategy, which conceivably might have achieved success against a more conventional defensive alignment, instead served as a stark, numerical testament to the principle that geometrically precise defensive planning possessed the undeniable capacity to utterly nullify even the most innovative tactical endeavors. With the advent of full daylight, Major General Vandergrift issued the command for the ultimate stage of his elaborate defensive blueprint to be set in motion. The 1st Battalion of the 1st Marines, expertly led by Lieutenant Colonel Creswell, initiated a deliberate upstream advance, with the objective of traversing Alligator Creek at a naturally dry crossing point situated roughly 3,000 yards inland, significantly removed from the intense skirmishes raging along the coastline. This pivotal movement epitomized the zenith of Vandergrift's systematic, engineering-centric philosophy of combat. Having judiciously employed pre-registered defensive bombardments to immobilize and decimate the initial enemy assault waves, he was now unleashing a dynamic, mobile contingent designed to utterly dismantle the entirety of the Japanese entrenched positions through a decisive, enveloping action. Please stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Please also leave a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. Lieutenant Colonel Creswell's battalion executed their crossing of the Upper Creek unimpeded, encountering no resistance, and subsequently initiated a systematic sweep down the eastern embankment. Their forward momentum was meticulously synchronized with ongoing artillery barrages, which effectively thwarted any attempts by Japanese forces to establish fresh defensive strongholds or orchestrate a disciplined retreat. This encircling contingent advanced with remarkable, methodical exactitude, their progression continuously shielded by the identical pre-registered artillery concentrations that had earlier provided crucial support during the defensive phase of the engagement. Upon reaching a point approximately 3,000 yards inland, the Marine units executed a pivotal turn towards the coastline, thereby ensnaring the remaining Japanese combatants within a rapidly constricting pocket, leaving them with no viable avenues of escape save for the very same lethal killing zone that had already exacted such a devastating toll. The dramatic appearance of Marine tanks making their way across the treacherous sandbar under the full light of day signaled the conclusive integration of Major General Vandergrift's comprehensive combined arms strategy. These formidable armored vehicles, which had been judiciously kept in reserve throughout the preceding nocturnal engagements to mitigate the risk of accidental friendly fire in the obscurity, now advanced resolutely across the fiercely contested terrain. Their primary mission was to furnish invaluable direct fire support for the advancing infantry. Although one tank regrettably succumbed to strategically placed Japanese mines, the remaining armored assets significantly augmented the mobile firepower available, enabling them to effectively engage emergent targets of opportunity and to systematically assist in the methodical eradication of enemy strongpoints. Precisely at 0700 hours, Marine Fighter Squadron 223, having recently deployed to Henderson Field on August 20th, initiated its inaugural aerial interception, promptly commencing strafing runs that effectively sealed off any lingering escape pathways along the beach. This flawless incorporation of air support into the overarching ground tactical scheme vividly illustrated the seamless manner in which Vandergrift's defensive engineering principles had morphed into decisive offensive maneuvers, employing the identical mathematical exactitude that had underpinned the earlier defensive triumph. By 1700 hours, all vestiges of organized Japanese opposition had evaporated, signifying that the revolutionary application of mathematical principles within American defensive doctrine had achieved an unequivocal and comprehensive tactical vindication. As the pall of battle smoke dissipated on the morning of August 22nd, the profound mathematical precision underpinning Vandergrift, his defensive engineering became quantifiable through stark numerical data, figures that were destined to fundamentally reconfigure American tactical doctrine for the duration of the Pacific War. A grim tally of between 774 and 800 Japanese combatants lay deceased across the constricted sand spit and the adjacent coastal zones, their fallen forms strewn in configurations that eloquently attested to the geometric flawlessness of the interlocking machine gun suppressive fires and the devastating efficacy of canister rounds. A mere 15 individuals from Colonel Ichiki's formidable assault contingent were apprehended alive, the vast majority being injured personnel rendered incapable of further combat. In stark contrast to these staggering losses, American forces sustained casualties numbering between 34 and 44 killed in action, alongside approximately 75 wounded. The casualty exchange ratio specifically at the Sandspit itself neared an astonishing 20 Japanese fatalities for every American life lost. An indisputable mathematical affirmation of defensive engineering that surpassed even Vandergrift's most ambitious forecasts. The personal destiny of Colonel Ichiki himself emerged as a potent symbol of the profound clash between deeply ingrained traditional Japanese offensive strategies and the burgeoning American defensive ingenuity. Numerous historical narratives indicated that the distinguished regimental commander chose to end his own life subsequent to witnessing the utter annihilation of his attacking force, though certain scholarly accounts introduced an element of uncertainty regarding the precise conditions surrounding his demise. What remained beyond dispute, however, was the undeniable fact that an elite Japanese officer, one who had spearheaded successful military campaigns throughout Asia, proved incapable of recalibrating his tactical mindset to surmount a defensive framework predicated upon rigorous mathematical principles, rather than relying on conventional military valor. The psychological repercussions of this devastating setback were destined to reverberate throughout the Japanese command hierarchy, compelling a re-evaluation of fundamental preconceptions concerning American combat prowess and their unwavering defensive determination. In the immediate aftermath of the ferocious engagement, Private First Class Pomeroy meticulously inspected his M19 17A1 machine gun, discovering that its water-cooled barrel retained a residual warmth, a testament to the relentless and sustained fusillade of fire that had defined the preceding night's combat. The profound mathematical precision inherent in the defensive barrages had been irrefutably validated, not merely through the grim statistics of casualties inflicted, but equally through the flawless mechanical operation of the weapon systems, which had performed precisely according to their intricate engineering specifications. The sophisticated water-cooling apparatus had effectively averted any overheating of the barrel, even during protracted periods of engagement at cyclic rates of fire that would inevitably have led to the catastrophic malfunction of air-cooled weaponry. Furthermore, the pre-registered artillery concentrations had consistently impacted within mere yards of their designated targets throughout the darkness, unequivocally demonstrating that mathematically derived fire control could attain a level of accuracy that individual gunners, relying solely on visual observation, could never hope to emulate. The profound tactical ramifications stemming from the Battle of Alligator Creek transcended the confines of a solitary night of intense combat. Major General Vandergrift had definitively demonstrated that contemporary warfare fundamentally favored systematic engineering and meticulous planning over the spontaneous valor of individual heroism. He had conclusively shown that defensive fortifications, meticulously conceived and designed with mathematical exactitude, possessed the inherent capability to yield outcomes that conventional military wisdom had previously dismissed as utterly unattainable. Indeed, the counterintuitive doctrine of permitting enemy forces to advance to within grenade-throwing proximity before unleashing a devastating barrage of fire directly contravened every established manual and training regimen within the United States Marine Corps. Nevertheless, this audacious approach had undeniably culminated in the most decisive tactical triumph achieved by American forces since their entry into the Pacific War. Barely 3 weeks after its initial conceptualization, the defensive blueprint meticulously crafted at Alligator Creek was put to its ultimate harrowing trial. An imposing force of approximately 3,000 Japanese soldiers, spearheaded by Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi, launched a meticulously synchronized offensive against the entrenched Marine positions along the strategic high ground later immortalized as Edson Ridge. This brutal engagement, unfolding between September 12th and 14th, served as a vast proving ground for Vandergrift, innovative defensive engineering tenets now applied on an exponentially grander scale. Once more, the efficacy of carefully prepared strongpoints, the precise devastation of pre-registered artillery barrages, the lethal web of interlocking machine gun fire, and the unwavering discipline of fire control mechanisms demonstrated their unparalleled superiority when confronting the relentless, often fanatical, Japanese night assault tactics. The relentless waves of Kawaguchi's attacking formations sustained a grievous toll, estimated at between 700 and 800 killed in action, while the American defenders, depending on the historical account consulted, suffered approximately 100 fatalities. This stark disparity underscored a crucial insight: the intrinsic mathematical correlation between sophisticated defensive engineering and quantifiable tactical triumph remained steadfast and pronounced, even as the intensity and scope of the combat escalated dramatically. Surveying the aftermath of the fierce fighting, Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Pollock, whose battalion had been instrumental in executing Vandergrift's groundbreaking defensive philosophy, grasped the profound significance of their actions. He realized they had participated in an event far exceeding the confines of a mere tactical skirmish. The astonishing precision with which the overlapping fields of fire had functioned, creating impenetrable kill zones, the utterly devastating effectiveness of pre-planned artillery concentrations, and the shattering impact of canister rounds unleashed at point-blank range collectively illustrated a revolutionary concept. Warfare, under the right conditions, could be systematically reduced to a series of mathematical equations. This required commanders to possess not only strategic acumen, but also the unwavering discipline to rigorously implement systematic engineering principles. Furthermore, the inherent psychological hurdle, the visceral instinct to engage the enemy at a distance, to prevent their approach of deliberately permitting armed enemy combatants to close within mere yards of defensive lines, had been decisively overcome. This triumph was not born of spontaneous acts of individual bravery, but rather forged through rigorous training and an unshakable confidence in the geometric precision of their meticulously planned defenses. Stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Write a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. The far-reaching strategic ramifications of this pivotal engagement would profoundly shape and refine American defensive doctrine across the entire expanse of the Pacific theater. Throughout the subsequent island-hopping campaigns, from the bloody beaches of Tarawa to the volcanic slopes of Iwo Jima, island garrisons would diligently adopt and adapt the invaluable lessons gleaned from Alligator Creek. They would employ sophisticated mathematical fire planning and precise geometric positioning to achieve tactical outcomes that the more conventional defensive strategies of previous eras could never have conceived. The seemingly counterintuitive, yet remarkably effective concept of consciously sacrificing immediate space in exchange for mathematical certainty, deliberately drawing enemy forces into predetermined killing zones where defensive fires could be unleashed with maximum pre-calculated effectiveness, would swiftly become the standardized operating procedure for American forces confronting the relentless and often suicidal Japanese assault tactics. Central to the realization of this mathematical warfare, yet often overlooked in the cold calculus of strategy, was the invaluable human element personified by Jacob Vuza. This courageous Solomon Islander, whose intelligence contributions were pivotal, had enabled the Marines to construct their defensive trap with such astonishing precision. His harrowing ordeal, capture, and brutal torture by Japanese forces, followed by his daring escape and urgent warning to American commanders, provided the critical tactical intelligence. This information was absolutely indispensable for implementing Vandergrift as defensive engineering principles at the precise moment and in the exact location where they would prove most effective. Without Vuza's detailed insights into Japanese troop strengths and their intended avenues of approach, the geometric perfection of the Marine defensive scheme, however brilliant on paper, might well have been tragically wasted on an empty battlefield. Ultimately, the most profound and enduring lesson bequeathed by the events at Alligator Creek was this: victory was achieved not through conventional means, but by transforming a desperate night attack into a solvable numbers problem, with the solution being delivered at a mere 20 yards. Traditional military wisdom had long dictated that enemy forces should be engaged as far forward as possible, targets intercepted at their maximum effective range, and adversaries prevented from ever closing to decisive combat distances. Vandergrift's truly revolutionary methodology, however, had deliberately contravened every established principle of conventional defensive doctrine. Instead, it leveraged mathematical precision to fundamentally transmute close-range combat, a realm typically seen as a crucible for individual courage and sheer willpower, into a meticulously calculated equation. Within this new paradigm, geometric positioning and the flawlessly coordinated deployment of fires became the irrefutable guarantors of tactical success. Thus, the era of defensive engineering had dawned, heralding a profound and lasting transformation in the very nature of infantry combat for the remainder of the Pacific War.